Okay.
Yes.
It's starting.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. This is a new experience for me. As a writer, I tend to do most of my work behind closed doors in a quiet place and working long hours. And certainly what I'm talking about tonight is a project that really has been going on for, when the books came, my children were here, and I said, Dad started working on this when I retired in 2012. And my son, the lawyer, was quick to correct me and say, Dad, I can remember in the early 2000 period, you sitting on the train and writing, handwriting in notebooks, where you started this story. So it's, but it's been a labor of love, if you will. As June pointed out, how the question I always ask is, how do we honor our parents? And the book is titled Moe Fields, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But my mom gets equal consideration and coverage in the story in the book. Obviously, I had two parents, and they were both very strong individuals, and both athletes, and both very competitive. And I think that's what I describe in the book, that it was a Depression era love story. And I'm sure many who are listening and watching today can relate to that, because we all had parents who grew up during that era, and it was quite different than what our kids experience today. I'd like to read just a small snippet just to start us off, and I won't go to the serious stuff right away, and I hope you will ask questions, because as I told Celeste in June, I didn't want this to be a one-way conversation, only just talking at you for an hour. I'd much prefer to have questions and things that you might want to know about the book or about the process of writing a book. Any of those things are open for query. There's a section in the book where I talk about the three brothers are together. It's near the end of the book, but and it's after the Jewish holidays, and they're sitting around talking about their parents. And the character in the book, all the names, by the way, my brother's names, my mom's name, only my dad's name stays in the book, but I've changed all the names to afford them a certain degree of privacy. And as I explained in the disclosure up front, this is my perspective on the story of three brothers and two parents. Their perspective may be different. So I didn't want to try and represent that this was absolute truth, because I don't think any of us own the truth. We all have a way of viewing it and experiencing it. So anyway, so Zach in the story, which is a nickname I have, is telling his brothers, I guess what I remember is Dad's work ethic. Zach said, smiling. I recall as a 10-year-old when Dad took me on a job in Lodi, New Jersey. Dad was a plumber, by the way. It was a Cape Cod house. I remember it so well. We climbed the stairs to the second floor bathroom. I could smell it, even as we walked down the hallway. Dad walked into the bathroom and lifted the cover of the toilet. What he saw was a toilet bowl filled with paper and brown waste. He slowly turned to me and said, Zach, stick your hands in the toilet and see what's stopping it from flushing. The words hung in the air. I looked down at the toilet bowl and then up at my dad. I felt dwarfed next to his 6'2" frame, 250 pounds, with those long arms that reached down past his waist and connected the largest set of hands I've ever seen. You both know that Dad never gave instructions more than once. If we didn't hear him or respond, the next experience was the back of his hand. The crack was so fast and furious, it would take several minutes before the pain registered in our brain. In Dad's day, there was no sparing the rod. The boundary lines and expectations were clear. I wasn't about to challenge his instructions. Yes, I did hesitate, but Dad was not smiling. He was serious. So I took off my coat, rolled up my shirt sleeves. I reached deep into the toilet bowl with a determination that I hoped he would be proud of. After several minutes, fishing around for an answer that I did not have, I pulled my hands out. The brown goo clung to my fingers. I literally had poop all over me. Once again, I looked up to Dad for direction. Dad paused for a minute to reinforce his message. He looked down at me. He then spoke slowly. Zach, now you know the meaning of work. If you're not afraid to get your hands dirty, you'll be okay. Now go wash your hands. It gives you a little bit of sense of my father's discipline, but also his sense of humor about things. The book starts telling a story about a young fella. My dad starts, he was 15 in the book, and his parents were trying to survive the Depression. And at 15, they split up, the parents, because his father, while a good father and a religious family, he had a bad gambling habit, and he would lose money that they would need for rent. So when the parents split up, there were 4 siblings in the family. My dad at the time was 15. He took off, ran away from home, and joined the circus. And he went to Philadelphia, where he would hop freight trains, and he would see advertisements for people looking for employees who would work in the circus. And he figured it was better than staying in Brooklyn at the time. And so he took off and went down there. He was there for almost 2 years. And he traveled with the circus, and he was setting up tents and sort of a worker, if you will. He was always larger than most of the people his age. And my mom used to say at 17, he looked like he was 25. At 22, he looked like he was 30, and he'd be wearing his double-breasted suit and top hat and spats, and he'd be going up to the Harlem Ballroom to go dancing and stuff. So he had this quality to him. And one of the things that I discovered in the process of writing the book, I knew from my mother the stories of my dad at 17, as he came back from the circus. He had discovered and seen boxers in Chicago. The circus had traveled around the country, and he decided that he wanted to come home to Brooklyn, become a fighter. And I didn't know this at the time. You know, I had heard the story from my mom, but I started doing some research. But and I don't know if anyone in the audience knows this, but from the mid-1920s to about the mid-1930s, it was called the Golden Age of Jewish fighters. And every weight class in boxing was controlled by a Jewish guy. And so I was able to start to do some research as a backdrop for the story about my father's involvement in boxing, and to share that as part of the book, because it's part of a history that I don't think is that well known. I mean, I knew of Max Baer, but I learned about a guy named Benny Leonard, who, in the book, there's some cute stories. Benny Leonard must have won 3 different weight class titles in boxing, and he kept gaining weight to fight the next boxer up in the ranks. And he got to a point where he won the middleweight, and he came home, and his Jewish mother said, "Benny, that's enough. No more fighting." And the next day, Benny Leonard actually retired from boxing because his Jewish mother said she didn't like the idea of him fighting. But my dad was a little bit different story. He fought in the 1932 Golden Gloves. He had made it to the quarterfinals of the Golden Gloves. Again, the research uncovered, for me at least, that there was a lot of, what do we call it, graft, things going wrong in boxing where people were paid to take dives and fighting. And the Golden Gloves was supposed to be an amateur league and is supposed to really be very strict to avoid those kinds of things. My dad got caught up. He had a brother who was a weightlifter, and the brother dragged him to the gym during the Golden Gloves tournament. And the rules said that that was not permitted. They called it overtraining. And so they disqualified him. He got tossed out of the Golden Gloves as he went into the quarterfinals. And the last fellow he beat was the fellow who actually won it in his weight class. But my dad took it hard in the sense that he wasn't able to continue to pursue his dream, and he turned instead to, in those days in Brooklyn, what they called bootleg boxing. And it was essentially a bar. In the back of the bar was a boxing ring, and people would come from all over Brooklyn to fight, and they would bet on the fights. It would be people all around the ring betting on it, and the fighter got $20 for fighting and a piece of the purse. And my dad saw that as an opportunity to now become an entrepreneur and bring some money home and help his mother and his siblings make it through the Depression period. So the book, I'm going to read you another small passage, but the book starts out with my dad as a fighter, and I'll explain that reason to you. I think you'll get it as I read it. But bear with me, I'm just going to read you a short passage. It actually is my favorite part, the first opening of the book. In college, we used to learn all this, the first line of a book is so important. And I spent months and months and months trying to write what I thought would be a powerful first line. We'll let other book critics make the judgment call on this. He could not feel the pain. His pride got in the way. Blood showered down across his chest as he landed against the ropes. For the first time, his nose had been broken. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He fought back. His name was Moe Fields. The blood continued to flow down Moe's face and chest. He spit to his right, clearing the blood in his throat. He was unaware of the crowd as the blood sprayed down on the people in the first row. A woman stood cheering Moe on, proudly wearing his blood on her pale yellow dress. The outside of the ring was a blur. At that point, Moe's pain was numbed by a determination no one had ever seen before. He clearly knew he was outclassed by a real professional. It can't be the money. After all, this was bootleg boxing at the back of a neighborhood bar in the 1930s. The boxer got paid $20 per match and a percent of the betting, but the purses for the fights weren't very large. No one here ever really made it to the professional ring. Most were just working stiffs who fought to make a few dollars during the Depression. There's something mysterious about boxers. You see a guy like Moe get his nose broken, and you wonder why they go on. He's out there sucking blood down his throat in a frantic effort so he can breathe. With Moe, it seemed as if he couldn't feel the pain. Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe there's a switch in the fighter's head that turns off when they get in trouble. Suddenly, there's nothing left between you and the outcome of the fight, except the inner voice that just won't quit. In the ring, you're alone as you'll ever be in life. Some say it's a false bravado that keeps you going. Others call it pride. Moe was hurt badly, but he just didn't know how to step back. He would not give in, and he would not be defeated. There's a lot about my father in that opening of the book that really became the inspiration for writing the book. We all know our parents, oftentimes in a very superficial kind of way, because I have this experience now with my own children. They usually don't ask a lot of questions as they're growing up, and they get to adulthood, and then they're busy with their own lives, and they think they know us based on their interactions with us, but how well do they really know us? There was something inside of my father that drove him and gave him a sense of determination and perseverance that, when I asked myself, what is the essence of my dad, those opening paragraphs are it. And they served him throughout his whole life, through World War II, during very difficult times when they were attacked. His Navy ship was attacked by the Germans, and they bombed the ship. And he was cited for an award for helping go down into the ship. And as a plumber, he understood the danger the ship faced, because there was fires going on below deck, and there was fear that the boilers on the ship might blow up. And rather than run in the other direction, as most of the sailors were doing, he ran down into the fire to shut the boilers down and save the ship. So there are qualities there as you move into the story beyond the war, into the middle of his life, where he starts a business in northern New Jersey, a plumbing business. And there's anti-Semitism that's touched on throughout this story and throughout the book. I think we all know historically that the pre-war period, there was anti-Semitism was rife. There was a lot of pro-German sentiment in the United States, so the fighter in him had to deal with that in many places on the ship. And I found some really interesting stories about him. Certainly my mother gave some of them to me, but during the course of writing, I actually, there was a website where different Navy ships were listed, and you could put your father's name, and other people did. And then I actually had correspondence with someone in California whose father was on the same ship as my father. And Sid Mayton, who's credited in front of the book, in 2012, Sid Mayton was 88 years old. He was still alive, still lucid, and had all these stories to share with me about my dad from World War II. And that was rich in terms of filling in gaps that my brothers and I would never have known. But as Sid would tell me, his ship was called the Catoctin, and there were 600 sailors on the ship, only 10 Jewish sailors. And so all the Jewish guys knew each other. They'd get together and have a minyan. They'd pray together. And the other thing Sid shared with me, which, I don't know how my brothers and I didn't know this, but my dad was one of the oldest sailors on the ship. He was 28 years old. He went into the Navy in 1943. And as Sid would tell it, Sid was 17. He lied on his forms. Most of the sailors on the ship were 17, 18, 19, 20, maybe. Most of them were from places like Mississippi, Alabama, they had never actually seen a Jewish guy before. Didn't honestly know what a Jewish guy was. So, the stories that Sid shared with me were very rich and gave me a basis for some of the stories that I put into the book as the Catoctin went from, it was not a fighting ship, it was a technology, telecommunications vessel, and it was really used for the planning of the invasion of southern France. So the ship went to Algiers and then to Italy, and all the different armed services leaders would gather on that ship and plot out how they were going to undertake the invasion of southern France. And so the portion of the book is the war, and I'm still in the first third of the book. That portion of it, I learned some history that I didn't know doing research. The invasion of southern France was actually planned to occur at the same time as the Normandy invasion, and but it was delayed because the Allies faced pretty fierce opposition in northern Italy from the Germans, and so the invasion of southern France was pushed back 3 or 4 months. And I guess the good part of that story is that they learned the lessons from Normandy as to how they were going to approach the landing and the attack, so that they didn't lose as many soldiers as they did at Normandy. No one will talk about this. Maybe there are history books that talk about it, but there were some mistakes at Normandy in terms of the terrain and how they planned the attack uphill, and the Germans were shooting down on them. That didn't happen in the invasion of southern France, and they actually were able to move up through Toulon and Marseille very quickly and took France. They actually almost beat the Normandy invasion crew up the center of the country, and that gave them supply routes to bring the Allies into Europe. So his ship was used for the planning of that. Unfortunately, as a communications vessel, as soon as the invasion was underway and they were succeeding, the Eighth Fleet, which was all together at one point, dispersed, and his ship was left to defend itself. And the story in the book talks about, he used to have crews of sailors go out in boats and blow smoke and fog around the ship to hide it on the ocean. And they were successful in doing that to protect it from attack from the Germans. And they were successful in doing that for several days. And then on one night, there were strong winds, and the winds blew the fog away from the ship, and they became sitting ducks for the German pilots who flew overhead and dropped bombs on the ship. And the Catoctin lost a number of sailors that night, and many more were injured during that struggle. So that's all part of the story. And the war part of the book and the fighting part of the book, there's a sort of a continuum, if you will. Moe Fields is still Moe Fields, feeling that he has to overcome whatever these obstacles are. When he gets back to the States, he's coming back to Brooklyn. My older brother was born in Brooklyn, and but my mother was a strong force in the family, and didn't want us to talk like my cousins, and Tori in Fourth Avenue, and so she insisted that the family move out to Paramus. And at the time, in the 50s, Paramus was largely a German and Italian town, and there was a fairly robust anti-Semitic feeling in the town. And my dad joined up with a Irish realtor who's talked about in the book, and I don't use his real name, but the two of them would go door to door in Paramus to try and drum up business because people didn't want to hire either one of them. And they would offer to do the job or offer to sell a house at a discount just to try and drum up business. And he started a plumbing business from scratch in Paramus, and it became one of the largest plumbing. He became one of the largest plumbing and heating contractors in all of North Jersey. He had licenses in 80 towns in North Jersey and into New York. He started to diversify into excavating. I mean, he was a business guy, and he was very successful at what he was doing. He didn't graduate high school, but he could look. He had a mathematical mind that he could walk into a warehouse or into a home, and he could look at the ceiling and within inches tell you how much pipe was needed to do whatever was necessary in the home. The middle of the book starts the path of where the family faced tragedy. So my dad was injured in the war. On the way back, I left out, after the invasion of southern France, his ship was then used and went to Yalta in 1945. And the planning for the Yalta conference with Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill was done on my father's ship. And the State Department, all the officials came and planned that. Now Roosevelt was the story as I discovered, Stalin was really a nasty guy to Roosevelt because Roosevelt was ill at the time. We've all seen, I think, the recent story, Atlantic Crossing, and there's been some other movies on TV about Yalta, but they made Roosevelt travel to Crimea. Stalin refused to go any further than Crimea to meet Churchill and Roosevelt. So Roosevelt had to take a ship across the ocean and then fly from Europe all the way to Crimea and then go in a car for 6.5 hours on these war-torn roads in order to get to the Yalta conference. But at the end of the conference, the Catoctin who they used, and you can't, if any of you have seen the map, you can't park a boat by Yalta. It's a peninsula. You have to, all the ships had to park in a town called Sevastopol, which is on the opposite side of the finger-like shape of the peninsula. And the British were there and the Americans were there. And they would have to travel by car. So all the officials who were going to Yalta from the United States and Britain had to drive 4 hours in order to get to the Yalta, to the palace where the Yalta conference was held. The only thing that Stalin did was they did give Roosevelt permission to actually stay at the palace where the conference was held because he was so sick. And he was the only leader allowed to stay there. Churchill stayed, it was interesting, Churchill stayed at a different palace, which when you went back and checked, it was actually designed by a Brit, 60 or 70 years prior. So they selectively picked that place because of its tie to the UK. But at the last day of the conference, the word was out that Roosevelt was going to stay on the Catoctin for one night before he went back to the United States. And so the commander of the ship knew this weeks in advance, and my father, who was kind of a jack of all trades in addition to being a plumber, Sid Maton used to tell me that every day they'd hear on the PA system, Goldstein to the quarterdeck, Goldstein to the quarterdeck. And all the Jewish guys would be, who is this guy Goldstein? And why is he always called up by the captain? And apparently he had a reputation for being able to figure out how to fix things. So when the senior guys from government and the Army and the Navy stayed on the ship, he worked with Sid and a crew of guys to bring pipes through the refrigeration system so that there would be cooling in the cabins where the top officials were staying. And it's things like that you wouldn't think were important, but actually during the summer months during the war were very important to the guys who were the top leaders. So he was called to the deck and told that Roosevelt was going to be staying on the ship. And you wouldn't think this was a big deal, but the president was in a wheelchair. So Murray was asked if he could build a handicapped toilet in a stateroom. The stateroom was going to be built with a handicapped toilet for the president of the United States. And I heard this story when I was a little kid, and I used to think, what's the big deal? I mean, you never really thought about how complicated that might be and how important that might be for the president. So he did undertake that, and he did get a chance to actually meet FDR on the ship, who thanked him for building a toilet. And he, I guess if that was his zenith of importance in terms of government, so be it. But he took a lot of pride in the fact that he was able to accomplish that. On the way back from the war, he did get injured because he stopped in Naples to pick up supplies and boats and stuff like that. And there was an accident on the ship, and one sailor was killed, and he was seriously injured, getting hit in the head. Years later, as he succeeded in his plumbing business, in 1955, he had his first brain tumor. And it took years, but they eventually found the medical records from the ship, and they attributed some of the cause of the brain tumor to the serious head injury they suffered during the war. But the challenge in the story of my family was that the three of us were here already, but we had no idea that my father faced maybe slim chances of survival from a brain tumor at 40 years old. And he did survive, but he was paralyzed on one side of his body. So here you have this gigantic guy, this boxer, this physical guy, and suddenly he can't talk. He has slurred speech, he has blurred vision, and he's paralyzed on one side of his body. And my mother, who was cut from the same cloth, who was a handball champion from Brooklyn, and a musician who used to tour the Catskills as a teenager, playing sax and clarinet in an all-women's band in the 1930s. They were a match made for each other, and she was the person who both challenged and inspired him to recover. And he did ultimately gain back his ability to walk, talk, work, and he went back and resumed work. And part of the story is how he redoubled his commitment and effort to then try to financially secure his family. He was obsessed after that period with trying to make certain that he was focused on how to protect the rest of the family if something like that should happen again. And he started buying real estate. He started to invest money. Rather than just grow his plumbing business, he tried to expand into other things and have money protected from the business in a way that if the business went under, the family would still have assets and be able to survive. 1961, and the book goes into the story about the family, and there's some funny stuff. just see if I can find this. Where is my, I had all these notes organized, and I'm missing the one I'm looking for. Okay. I don't know where it went to. Oh, here it is, 149. He worked 6 days a week. We hardly ever saw him, and which makes you wonder, why is he such an important character in our lives when he worked 6 days a week? But what he tried to do was to take us with him. And so this is a very short thing. Murray wanted to be a good father, but following his brain tumor, he became even more obsessed with growing his business and investing his money in stock and real estate. He made almost $1,000 a week, by the way, in the stock market, investing. He would just buy small stocks and turn them over. He didn't keep things for long periods of time. He wasn't looking to be a large investor, but he was looking to earn money. And all that quick turnover he used to give to my mother for cash. He often worked 6 days a week. He was gone by 6 a.m. before anyone in the family was awake. He rarely got home before 6:37 p.m. Franny tried her best to make the children wait for dinner so they could eat together as a family. And I would just stop here for 30 seconds and acknowledge and compliment my wife who's watching, because I had a crazy kind of schedule when I was working, not getting home till 7:30, commuting to New York 4 hours a day. And the one thing that my wife always insisted was to have the children wait so we could have dinner as a family. So I thank her for that. So thank you, dear. Eventually, to compensate, Murray decided to start bringing his sons to work with him during school vacations. Alan and Zach were old enough to come to the shop and work with Dad. When they traveled with their father, the boys always thought they were in a Charlie Chan movie. Murray would introduce each son. Oh, this is my number 1 son, or this is my number 2 son. Rarely would he use their name at work. Number 2, can you go sit over there while I talk to Mr. Gardner about this job? In time, Alan and Zach began to wonder if Dad had forgotten their names. Gary Goldman was the youngest son, nearly 4 years younger than Alan. So he didn't get to travel to work that often with Dad. But when he did, when he was taken along, he became number 3 son. The boys would watch Charlie Chan movies on TV and argue with each other. There was jealousy that number 1 son always seemed to be present at the critical moment in the movie when Charlie Chan figured out who committed the crime. Eventually, Murray's names for the boys became a badge of honor. When the opportunity presented itself, they preferred to be introduce themselves. Hi, I'm number 2. So we got to know him as we traveled with him and as he worked with us. By 1961, he was well on his way to being a multimillionaire, and the family was secure. And then in June of 1961, they had planned to go to a plumbers convention in Atlantic City. All 3 kids were supposed to go with them. And the last minute, my mom decided that, to leave us at home. And so that she and my dad could just have some quiet time and he could relax and rest up a little bit. And on that fateful day, 2 miles outside of Atlantic City, a drunk driver crashed into them and nearly killed my mom. And at 44, she would never walk again. She was crippled by a drunk driver. My dad was seriously injured. He was not able for months to go back to work. And the part of the story that I start to focus on a little bit in the book is that the three children, my older brother had just been bar mitzvahed in March. So he was 13, I was 10, and my youngest brother was 9. That my folks were in Atlantic City in a hospital fighting for their lives. My mother had 12 surgeries over the next 3 or 4 days, trying to piece together the damage that was caused. And we were alone in the house without supervision for 2.5 months. That we had uncles and aunts in Milford and Fairlawn, but no one would come. And worst of all, we couldn't get anyone to actually take us to Atlantic City to see our parents. So the book dwells on that a little bit because this idea about, we were so fearful of telling anyone what was actually going on because, we talked it over and we feared that if someone knew that we were in the house without an adult for that length of time, that the local authorities might come and take us away, put us someplace, separate us. So, we decided that we would lie. And it was not something that my mother approved of at home, but we would essentially lie to all the neighbors when they asked us how our folks were, and we'd say, that we have someone staying with us and watching over us. And they eventually did come home, and we had to become the caretakers for our parents. And my mother was in a body cast for 6 months from her chest. In those days, they did this stuff. I don't think today they would do this, but in those days, she was in a body cast from her chest to her toes. And the only thing cut out was so that I could bring her a bedpan, and so she could go to the bathroom and I could wipe her, because she couldn't do it herself. And the three of us took over running the house, and that's part of the story. And but the idea of it is in the book is not so much the trauma, but where do you draw strength from? Where do you look for the role models that challenge you to, my dad used to tell us, and it's always stayed with me. He used to tell us, in the ring, everybody gets knocked down. And it's what you do afterwards that defines your character. And so those were the things that challenged us to step up and to take over, take charge, if you will. And that's the middle part of the book in terms of how we did step up. And my dad made the decision a year after the accident to completely walk away from his business, to let the business die, and move the whole family to Florida for a year to try and help my mom walk again using crutches. And that his dedication to her and commitment to her knew no limits. And that was also a lesson for us, from a father, in terms of how you handle setbacks and how you handle obstacles. And we did move to Florida, and every day after school, my older brother and I would, we had a small house, but it had a swimming pool in the back. And every day we would be taking my mom into the swimming pool to teach her to walk and to strengthen her body so she could eventually, over the course of that year, walk again using crutches. Of course, my father was never one to give up on my mom. And when we came back to New Jersey, maybe a year and a half after that, he insisted he wasn't taking no for an answer. He went out and bought her a brand new car and insisted that she drive again. And he would take her out, just the two of them, and then eventually he would take the whole family out, and he'd make her drive, starting on back roads and then eventually on the highway. And it really sort of helped my mom regain her sense of freedom, sense of independence, her sense of value. So as a role model of parents, they both demonstrated a commitment to the idea of family that I think comes from growing up in a Jewish home. I think there is something very strong culturally. I know my dad's family was very religious. My mom's family, maybe not as much, but I'm of the generation, the rabbi doesn't know this, but I'm of the generation where they drop you off at the synagogue and say, you better learn. And it wasn't so much an example at home as they expected somewhere along the way a rabbi and teachers at Hebrew school would school us so that we had the same sort of feeling for it. So anyway, the last part of the book, taking much too long, I gotta stop and let you guys ask some questions. But the last part of the book is really about the three brothers and how we did not always get along. But the one thing my mother contributed to this band of brothers, if you will, was this sense that, it's all for one and one for all. And regardless of our differences, we understood what it meant to face trauma. We saw, my dad had a second brain tumor later on in life. My mom had open heart surgery later on in life. There was always another shoe ready to drop that we had to accept that this is part of what the challenge of life is, and that we would make it through if we stuck together. And so the last part of the book is really about us, how all three of us were, knock on wood, successful in our own careers. So, when I talk about this with at home with my own children, I'd say, on the one hand, we face these terrible traumas. And I talk about, there's a whole section of the book where I talk about what it is to be alone in your life and not have your parents there. Because that was something that was very traumatic at 10 years old for me and for my brothers. But on the other hand, out of my father's example, sort of the grit, if you will, we were never afraid to take on responsibility. And so we each became somewhat leaders in our own field and our own profession. My older brother was a top federal prosecutor at one time and a litigator in court. He actually had a witness die on him during cross-examination in a criminal trial. And there's a story about that in the book that I present kind of humorously, but it's not humorous at all. But those things were part of the triumph, if you will. So there's trauma and there's triumph. And at the end of the book, it's all about family. And it's all about what we teach the next generation. Anyway, I apologize. I said I wasn't going to talk to you straight on, and yet I've rambled on for 40 minutes. So I hope someone has a question.
We actually do. What a fantastic story. Thank you so much for sharing the book and your family and so forth. So we have a great question to start off. And the question is, do you still dance and do cartwheels?
Yes. My neighbors will tell you that I still do cartwheels and handsprings down the middle of our street Occasionally I walk on my hands, but I won't tell you it's getting any easier. But my wife will tell you I'm still a ham.
And was Rabbi Rachman based on your rabbi?
Yeah, I'm glad somebody asked that question. In the book, and I've tried not to give away too much. I hope I've given enough that you guys will be interested in going and buying it. But there's a story in the book when my parents were in the car accident, and we could not get an aunt and uncle in New Jersey or one coming from New York. It's a sensitivity. My wife always says, you got 21 first cousins. You don't talk to any of them. Unfortunately, the parents of those cousins were never there for us and weren't able to help us. And Rabbi Rakowitz, Myron Rakowitz, who I believe is still alive, we actually asked him when my mom passed if he would come and officiate at her service, and he did, because he knew my parents well. My father was one of the founding members of the Paramus Jewish Community Center. He donated large sums of money, and he also did all the plumbing and heating in that huge building now that is there. Rabbi Rakowitz, though, when he heard from the community that we could not get a relative to take any of us to see my parents in Atlantic City, he called and spoke to my older brother and volunteered in his broken down old car. Rabbis don't get paid much money, forgive me, but at least in those days they didn't. And he drove my brother all the way to Atlantic City so he could visit my mother. And there's a whole section in the book which is pretty true and very touching about the rabbi coming and talking to my mother and giving my mother encouragement to overcome some of the despair and suffering that she experienced. And so rabbis are important to us in life, and Rabbi Kornsgold, just as Rabbi Rakowitz, has always been there as a supporter and encourager and a source of comfort when needed. So those things are always there and important to us.
Thank you. I also wanted to note I was bat mitzvahed and my daughter's baby naming was at the Jewish Community Center Paramus. So you'd never know how full circle life is. And so I will always think of your father, and we had a lot of great Jewish memories there. So thanks.
There's also, I should confess, Rabbi, that there's a story in there. I was the number 2 child, so I was the rebellious one at times. And if I felt wronged, I always had this strong sense that I needed to challenge injustice. And I had a rabbi who was also a teacher in I only went to 1 year of Hebrew school, and then the accident happened, and I didn't have the training for a bar mitzvah that my brothers did, but I actually told off the rabbi because I was supposed to get points for being in the Hebrew school band, and the rabbi didn't give me the points, and I felt injustice. And I came home and I told my mother, and my mother was appalled. How could you dare tell the rabbi that you were being treated unfairly? and she made me go back the next day and apologize to the rabbi. And so I have to apologize to all rabbis, because an offense against one is offense against all. I try to be better now.
So the next question is, did your father feel compelled to adopt the stage name Fields because of anti-Semitism?
No, actually, and I didn't know this story for a very, very long time. But my father's name was Morris. He went by Murray. But very later in life, I asked him once, and if anyone's read the book, in the last chapter of the book, I talk about this. I asked him why he used Moe Fields, and he told me that his father would never approve of his being a boxer, a fighter, and that if he heard that his son was fighting, whether the Golden Gloves or the bootleg boxing, that he would come down and try and stop him. And he never wanted to have a confrontation with his father. I can remember his father in his 80s. My dad would hug and kiss him. And I used to talk about that with my own children because, so often kids get older, and as they get teenage and into their college years, suddenly they stop hugging and they stop kissing because they think they're embarrassed. And one thing my father was never embarrassed to do was to show affection to his father. So he told me the story that he would never confront his father. And so rather than put himself in that position, he used an alias, and he invented the name Moe Fields as an alias rather than fight under his own name. So that's kind of where it came from.
So I had a question. A person that is like a founding member of a synagogue, Judaism must be very important to them and so forth. So what was it like growing up Jewishly? What were some of the Jewish traditions your parents wanted to share with you that thought were important that you maybe passed down to your children?
So my family life was, I'd say, very secular. My dad, as you heard from some of the excerpts, worked 6 days a week. He worked on Saturday. He didn't observe the Sabbath. My mom was from a school of thought of another generation, unlike we had at Bethel, where parents were encouraged to participate in school activities with their children. That we had Friday night services, and all the parents were there, engaged with their children as they learned. We didn't grow up that way, and especially by the time I was 10 years old, when they had the car accident, any activities whatsoever that we had as children, whether it was baseball, later in high school we participated in sports, but the idea of being home and taking care of parents was the only thing that was a priority. And so the religious aspects of home life were very limited. Dad came from, my father knew the whole service by heart. I'm sure in the Navy, he used to lead the services from what Sid tells me. So, it's not that they didn't come from, and it's not that they didn't talk. From the time I was a child, my parents said, one day we'd like to go to Israel. And again, it's that generation who always talked about it, but rarely went and rarely ever did. I would say that the most influential factor in my life, in terms of, I always, as a child, most influential thing happened before the car accident, is I could remember standing in the back of Paramus Synagogue and hearing the cantor sing. And somehow that experience has always drawn out of me a connection, feeling a sense of connection with religion and with Judaism. And that has always saved me. And it's not, we all, but I would say that the other thing that was most influential in my life was not as a child, but really meeting my wife and being in a home of two parents, her parents, who were Holocaust survivors, and attending holidays, and Trudy knows this as well, attending holidays where there were 30 people at the table who were all survivors in the same concentration camps, and listening to their stories, and standing in a Orthodox synagogue with the men in the row that I stood in, holding little Adam Goldstein in my hands as a child, as a baby. And the men would be praying without looking at the books and swaying back and forth, and the whole synagogue would be singing, and I would have tears in my eyes, thinking about what these people had been through and what they experienced. And I learned Hebrew, reading Hebrew, not in Hebrew school. I only had 1 year of Hebrew school, and then they had the car accident. I learned Hebrew standing next to Irit's father, Sam, as he read, and he read perfect Hebrew, in the synagogue. And I would follow the book with him, and I regained a sense of reading Hebrew. And I'm not a great Hebrew reader. You'll scare the pants out of me if the rabbi asked me to get up on the bima. But the sense of feeling for that, the sense of connection to that, the sense of purpose in that came a little bit later in life for me. Maybe it was always there from that early experience, but it became stronger as I got older, and I'm thankful because it became part of my children's lives. I was able to share with them a sense of commitment, a sense of feeling for Israel and for Judaism that I might not have had personally.
Okay. So any last call for questions?
Stu brought up my name because my parents were very good friends with Iris' parents. And they kind of, as part of that crowd of Holocaust survivors.
We were all in the synagogue together. And still is a very special thing to think about. I still miss those people. Maybe that's the next book, Trudy.
Okay.
All right, very nice. So Stu, I want to thank you so much. We all really enjoyed hearing about your father's stories and your book. And I know we'll all go out and buy your book. You can find the book on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And I would like to now introduce Rabbi Kornskold, who had a few words for this evening.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you. And thank you to June for putting together tonight's program. And thank you, most importantly, to Stu for writing the book and for sharing the words about the book. I was thinking about this as about tonight. So Adam Goldstein, who you referenced, your son, was actually one of the first B'nai Mitzvah that I did at Bethel. And if I do my math correctly, I believe he'll be turning 40 this year. Yes, right? He has bar mitzvah in November at 19.
No way. Right.
And Stu, I have to say that when you were talking about your mom and those stories, I did hear them for the first time, and it brought back memories for your mom's funeral, where you shared all this kind of stuff. And at the time, I was like, "What? 3 kids alone in the house?" It's actually really kind of, it's like you said, these days it's quite mind-boggling. But all of you did well, and I'm sure there were clearly many challenges. But I think that it's wonderful that you were able to write the book, and wonderful that we're able to read the book, and wonderful that we'll be able to learn those lessons from the book, and hopefully to pass them and to share them with others. So I want to thank you, and I hope you buy the book. I hope you read the book. And have you started your next book yet? That's a big question.
I have.
I knew it.
I have an outline. The next one would be a fiction book. This one was a labor of love. It's who writes a book about their father at 70, and and he's gone 45 years. But I really hoped that this book would be one that makes people feel connected with their families. That I'm not the only one who's dealt with trauma, and I just felt that, especially after COVID, that this would be a life-affirming kind of story. That out of it comes the next generation, and the next generation offers promise and hope. And if they learn the lessons of their parents and what's happened in the past, they can navigate and be empowered to do so. And the fighting image is obviously a theme throughout, because my dad never quit, and that's something which he inspired in us. And hopefully, my children have that tenacious quality as well. And firsthand, Adam was just when he did his bar mitzvah with you, his biggest worry was that his grandfather, who spoke perfect Hebrew, was sitting, and his grandmother were sitting in the first row, and he wanted to honor them and not make any mistakes. So this is a blessing as far as I'm concerned. So
absolutely. Your mother, what year did your mom die in?
Eric, was it 2004, 2005?
Yeah, so it was a while ago.
Yeah, it's and we didn't talk about the process of writing a book. I'm going to be very honest. I mean, I've written my whole life, but I never thought I could write a book. I mean, I didn't approach this with the sense. I mean, I've written speeches for CEOs. I've written for CEOs most of my career. I've written and published, as June and Celeste pointed out, in different publications. But when I started the journey, I didn't think I could actually write a book. And as you get into it, you just try and stay true to the story. Now, will this book sell? The jury's still out. But a friend who worked with me on the book and edited the book said, the most important person you wrote for is your kids. That you have that there's something that's a legacy. It tells a story about your parents that they would have never had. So, but I do hope it. I mean, it's getting some buzz. It's getting some positive reactions from book reviewers and stuff like that. So, we'll see. But publishing is a totally different animal today than it used to be. If I were Kanye West and had $1 million ad budget, it's a whole different story.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Than a first-time author, and the publisher got me to this point, but you're pretty much on your own to market and sell the book. So doing something like this tonight was, an experience and learning experience for me. So I thank you all for yielding and putting up with me and the stories. But it gives me an opportunity, as my wife would coach me, don't give such long answers.
Well, thank you very much. Learned a lot about you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well done.
Before we go, so to everybody, a round of applause. Thank you. We'd like to thank again the Werner Lecture Fund and the Men's Club, and June will be closing today's program. So take it away, June.
I want to thank you all for attending, coming from different worlds, an absolutely fascinating story. I'm glad you told it to us, and I will go out and buy a couple of copies and give them out. In the meantime, I have here a check for $500 to give from the Werner Lecture Fund to the Men's Club, because they decided to take down their shed, their utility shed. We want to help them build this great shed.
Amen.
Things in that are neat and tidy, and I'll go inspect it to make sure my money is used well.